Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Owana, and I'm the Associate Director of Development and Communications at Myeloma Canada. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening for our Myeloma Canada educational webinar on the drug approval process and what you can do to help, featuring our resident expert, Martine Elias, our Director of Access, Advocacy, and Community Relations at Myeloma Canada. For those of you who are more comfortable in French, we will be hosting this very same webinar tomorrow evening in French at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you would like to register for this particular webinar, you can visit our website at www.myeloma.ca under the News and Events tab. If you would like any additional information on the drug approval process, access, and/or advocacy in Canada, please visit our website once again at www.myeloma.ca. Under the About Multiple Myeloma tab, you will find a detailed subsection outlining these topics. Furthermore, all of our webinars are recorded and made available on our YouTube channel, so not to worry if you missed something or you would like to review the slides. It will be available on our channel probably as early as tomorrow. So to find our page, you can simply visit youtube.com and type Myeloma Canada in the search bar, or you can go to our website under the Resources tab and click on Myeloma Canada Educational Videos. Now, just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question during this presentation, so feel free to type out your questions using the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel on your computer screen. All the questions will be addressed and answered at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will now pass the mic over to Martine Elias for her presentation. We're very pleased to have Martine share with us the many layers of the drug development process, how they get to bedside of patients, and what you can do to help this process. So Martine, I guess we'll just test your mic first just to make sure it's working.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Is that good? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to take it from here. Thank you, everyone, and really appreciate you turning into this webinar tonight. Understanding the new drug development and reimbursement process in Canada is a very, very dry, not sexy topic at all. It is fairly process-oriented, and there's many layers, as Michelle initiated the conversation. So let me just turn to what our learning objectives are. So the first thing I'd like to go through with you is understanding how drugs are developed. So from the bench to bedside, so from molecule to human, and there are many phases of clinical trials. So I'm going to explain those fairly rapidly, but to give you a really good understanding of what they mean and what they do. Then we're going to talk about how myeloma treatments are approved in Canada, and then how drugs are paid for, because it doesn't mean that if a drug is approved by Health Canada that it's going to get paid for right away. And then lastly, how do we make our voices heard? Because I think that if you look at the reimbursement and the approval process, they are quite complex. They're not difficult, but they're complex and there are many layers. And one of our role in Myeloma Canada is to make sure that the patient's voice is heard throughout these development process and these reimbursement process, because we feel it's really important that we bring your voice to the table of the people who are involved in these different layers. So let me start with the drug development process. So when a researcher has an idea about a drug or how to develop a treatment for a condition, from that time to it being approved on the market for sale, it takes about 10 to 15 years. So it's a very, very long process. And there are many, many compounds that go through this development process. Anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 compound will enter the R&D, the research and development pipeline within a manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company. And only one at the end of that 15 years of development will probably receive approval. So all that costs a lot of money. In the US, it's estimated that for developing a drug from molecule to bench side, it will cost anywhere between $2 to $2.6 billion to develop one drug. In 2016, so last year, just in cancer alone, there was over 1,910 compounds that were being developed, which is very promising, obviously, from a cancer patient population. So let's look at the clinical trial process. How does it work? There are many phases, as I mentioned earlier, and they focus on very different aspects. So for example, phase 1 is on safety, then you look at doses, then dosing for a drug, and then you look at the efficacy, and then in post-marketing research studies that are conducted once the drug is approved on the market. So let's look at phase or the preclinical phase. So that happens before the phase 1. So that's all the labs and the potions and the lotions that get developed in a lab. And those studies are done before the drug gets into the human. So at that point, what they're looking for is safety and efficacy in animals. So they want to make sure that if the drug is given to an animal population, it is not going to have any negative or major side effects before it can be tested in human. And what they do in this phase is really look at the pharmacology of a new drug. So there's two things that they look. One is pharmacokinetics, and that's really the science of what your body does to a drug. So when you ingest a drug, then your stomach and your acid juices will destroy it and break it down, and it will go to your blood. Some of it will be absorbed through your tissues and go to where it should go. But all drugs don't always operate in the same way. So we have to really understand how that works. Then there's the pharmacodynamic, and that's what the drug does to your body. So if you're taking a cancer drug, then it would be how does the drug shrink your tumor, reduces your cancer load, etc. And then there's toxicology, which is also very important. So you have to determine very early on what the potential side effect could be. Because if the side effects in the animal model are quite grave and quite significant, then the drug will likely not move to the phase 1 clinical trial phase. So once all the preclinical studies are done, we move into what we call phase 1. And those trials usually are fairly small. They involve in cancer maybe 10 to 30 patients who have the cancer that's being studied. And usually these patients would be those who do not respond to standard treatment anymore. So these would be quite advanced cancer patients. And really what we want to do there is dose escalation. We want to see if the dose that are targeted for human are going to be safe. So they being the oncologists will start at smaller doses, and they will give the first 3 patients the drug. And if there is no or very few side effects, then they will increase the dose and give the drug again to 3 more participants, and so on and so on. And they'll increase the drug to the point where the side effects start to become maybe problematic, but obviously not severe side effects. So you really want to keep the safety and the side effect profile at the lowest level possible. And that's really the emphasis of the phase 1 clinical trial. We're really not looking at that point for the effectiveness, but just can the drug be tolerated. So they also do pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies at that point, and that's why patients are, sort of giving a lot of blood, because we're measuring the level of the drugs in the body. So that is also a component of the phase 1, but then it's in the human. Phase 1 can take about a year to complete, and of all the drugs that enter into phase 1, there's only about 70% of drugs that will pass this phase. So 30% will be eliminated and won't make it anywhere past phase 1. So once you've done your phase 1 clinical trial, then you can move into phase 2. And only if the phase 1 are conclusive. So these trials that are initiated in phase 2 would involve anywhere between 20 to 120 people with the target disease, so patients with cancer specifically. And these trials will look at whether the new treatment will work. So does it have an efficacy? Does it actually have an effect on the cancer? So at this time, the physicians will measure potentially tumor size or analyze blood tests to make sure that the treatment is having an effect on the cancer and the effect is positive. So these studies usually will be randomized. So what we mean there is that, patient will not know what they are taking. And we don't know if they're going to be under standard care or the therapy that's being analyzed or studies. They can be opened, which means that both the physician and the patient will know what drug they're taking, or they can be double blind, where that is not known. And the design being either open or double blind sometimes depends on the type of drug that are being studied. Drugs that are administered IV, for example, usually will be done in an open setting because it's really difficult to mask an IV administration, and you don't really want to give a saline solution. But a lot of times the oral drugs are being done in a double blind fashion where patients would be getting the active drug, and then the standard arm would be treated as a comparator. So in oncology, we never do placebo-controlled trial because that would be unethical. It's always compared to what is the standard of treatment at the time. So the emphasis of phase 2 trial is based on effectiveness and safety, and that's really important because at that point you start to determine if a drug is working for a particular cancer and patient population. And these trials can last about 2 years to complete from start to finish, and quite often there could be 1 or 2 or maybe 3 phase 2 trials that are being conducted. There's only about 33% of drug that will pass this phase. So then after phase 2, we move to the phase 3, and those are done usually in a much larger patient population, anywhere between 300 and many thousands of patients. And the goal of the phase 3 trial is to find if a new treatment is better than the standard treatment or has fewer side effects. So again, in these phase 3 trials, the design can be similar to phase 2, but they're done in a much larger patient population. They're usually randomized, and the doctor will compare maybe 2 or more treatment options. Sometimes they will look at what they call crossover, where patients will be given 1 drug and or standard therapy, and if they fail, they can be crossover to a different drug. And these trials can take up to 3 years to complete. And the emphasis again is on safety, efficacy in a larger patient population. And phase 3 trials are usually used for what we call the regulatory registration purposes. So those are the trials that would be submitted to the health authorities to get a drug approved for sale in a particular market. So in Canada, that would be Health Canada. Quite often there's 2 phase 3 trials that are done. They like to do 2 because they want to make sure that if the first trial is positive, that it is not an anomaly, and that the second trial really confirms the first one. They can look at different doses of administration in phase 3, but really, usually there's 2 trials that are done, especially in cancer. Again, not all drugs make it through this phase. Sometimes there's a lot of drugs that, don't work in a larger patient population, or you discover side effects that you hadn't anticipated, which makes it impossible to be marketed. So, anywhere between 25 and 30% of these drugs that go through phase 3 will make it and will get to the submission to the health authority process. So, once a drug is approved, we enter in what we call, or a sponsor can enter what we call into a phase 4 clinical trials. And these trials are usually done when the drug is approved by the health authority. So in Canada, it would be Health Canada, or US, the FDA, for example. And they are done for many different types of reasons. What we're seeing more and more now is phase 4 clinical trials that are done to look at real world. So that means that once a drug is on the market and is being used by a larger patient population, we want to see if the drug is performing in the same way as it did in clinical trial. We want to see if the safety of the drug continues, or if there's additional side effects that we hadn't sort of estimated or anticipated at this point. Because you can think that, phase 2 and phase 3 trial are done under very, very strict condition. There are protocols, there are inclusion, exclusion criteria that can be quite stringent. So once the drug is on the market, it's really important that we continue to study these drugs because they become very telling in terms of what happens to general patient population. And sometimes regulatory authority may require the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company to do these phase 4 trial because they want to look at confirming their decision, making sure that the data that they evaluated in phase 3 or through their approval process continues to manifest itself, and there's no issues with respect to safety with this drug, the drug in question. Phase 4 trials are also done to look at post-marketing surveillance and to detect any rare or long-term adverse effect that could happen in a larger patient population. So they're really important to continue the develop through the phase 4 trial to understand how a drug is performing in the targeted patient population. So the phases of clinical research are very structured, and they're very relevant to our Canadian environment because, here in Canada, just with respect to clinical trials, and this data is from the Innovative Medicines Canada, and back in 2016, so this is only maybe a year old, there was more than 4,500 clinical trials in Canada. And this is not necessarily just in cancer, but in all different therapeutic areas. Canada is a very fertile ground for clinical trials because we are close to some of the sponsors, which are located most of them are in the US. We also have very, very savvy and very much an expertise in doing clinical trials in many different areas. If you think just in myeloma, where we have the Myeloma Canada Research Network, and that's a group of clinicians and specialists in multiple myeloma that do clinical trials across the country. Our expertise is very much sought after from our counterparts, and that's why a lot of clinical trials are done in Canada, which is great because they do offer the opportunity to get access to new therapies and treatments that would not otherwise be available to our patient population. So, how do you get to know where a clinical trial or what clinical trial is done in your area? All patients, to be honest, are eligible to participate in a clinical trial. And if you hadn't had that conversation with your oncologist, you may want to broach the subject with them and try to understand if they are involved in clinical trial or if they have colleagues in the area that are involved with clinical trials that you may want to learn more about and see if you would be a good candidate for those trials. So you can also go to a couple of websites. One is clinicaltrial.gov, which is a US-based website that lists all the clinical trials that are done from the US perspective with centers, in Canada and elsewhere in the world. It's a huge web site where if you type in your condition, the drug you want to look at, or where you live, you may be able to find some information. Be patient because it is, as I said, a big website if you think it includes all the clinical trials that are done pretty much around the world. Then more specific to Canada is the Canadian CancerTrials.ca is a website that is supported by the Partnership Against Cancer, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, or CPAC. And their website I find is fairly up to date in terms of the trials, but you may not have all of the clinical trials listed there, but it's a really good tool and it's a bit easier to navigate. I looked at it myself just for myeloma trials, and many of them were listed on this website. And last but not least, and please visit us at our myeloma.ca website, where we have a section on clinical trial and can help you find clinical trial, and you can always call us. So I've run through the development of a drug from the molecule to the approval. So that means that it's ready to enter the Canadian market. But before it does, it has to be approved by a regulatory authority. And here in Canada, that is the Health Canada. And there are many layers for a drug to go from being approved by Health Canada to being funded. So we're going to look at these in fairly detailed in terms of what it means for you, the patient, and where does Myeloma Canada fit in all of these layers. Unfortunately, it's really not straightforward. And you would think that the Health Canada approval process would be. And if you look at more specifically, what does Health Canada do? So when a sponsor or pharmaceutical company has completed their clinical development process, they will put together a dossier which can fill maybe a room 10 by 10 with binders and papers, and they would go through the whole information from the clinical development process. So they would talk about the preclinical, they would talk about the animal studies, they would talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial. It would have the summary, it would have the data specific to every clinical trial, and it can also sometimes go to the patient level. So this dossier would be submitted to Health Canada, and they would look at it and review the clinical evidence from these clinical trials. And usually they would require phase 3 data. Sometimes dossiers can be submitted with only phase 2 trials and have been approved. For example, daratumumab was approved last June with only phase 2 data. And I'll talk maybe a little bit about that and some of the consequences that this may have for us. So what Health Canada will do is look at this data and determine if a drug is safe and effective. They first look at safety. Safety is of primary concern to them, which makes sense. And so if the drug is safe and meets the thresholds and the data is conclusive, they'll look at the efficacy as well and make sure that, you know, the drug actually does work. So what they would do is they would grant what we call a notice of compliance, so NOC for short, allowing the manufacturer who's made the submission to sell the product. Now, this notice of compliance will only be for the indication that the manufacturer has sought. So, for example, if you think about Revlimid, the first time it was submitted to Health Canada, it was for patients who had more advanced multiple myeloma. So I think it was for patients who undergone 2 or 3 more lines of therapy. And as the drug has been studied more, the company has submitted additional dossiers and have received NOCs for new indication. And the last one that they received was for stem cell non-eligible patients as first-line therapy. So a drug can continue to go through this clinical development process as it has been approved on the market for selling, by looking at different indication. And then the last thing that Health Canada does and puts a lot of focus is on safety monitoring. So any side effects that are recorded with a drug have to be reported back to Health Canada, and they will look at all this aggregated safety information and continue to deem the drug safe for sell on the Canadian market. But sometimes they can take drugs off the market. Think about Vioxx, which was a drug that was developed for pain. After it had been on the market for a number of years and used, there was a number of side effects that were being reported that were quite serious and problematic. So Health Canada made the company, or decided that the drug was not safe enough, and retracted their notice of compliance. So they were not allowed to sell on the Canadian market. So that whole process, from the time where the manufacturer submits their dossier to Health Canada to when Health Canada issues a notice of compliance, can take about, on average, 12 months. Cancer drugs are usually fairly close to that because, you know, they do review them quite quickly, and they have metrics. Health Canada has to report back their metrics in terms of the review, so you know approximately how long that would take for a review. So now Health Canada has approved the drug. They reviewed all the clinical data, and now the manufacturer can sell it on the Canadian market. But before or while this is all happening, I thought it'd be interesting to share with you how drugs prices are set in Canada. So there is a body that is called the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, or PMPRB, and they're a federal body. They report into the Minister of Health, and they work under what they call the Patent Act and Regulation. And their role is to ensure that prices of patented medicines sold in Canada are not excessive. We know drug prices are very high and they keep going up. So what they do is they review the average price of each of the patented medicine to make sure that they're not excessive. But how do you determine the average price? Because, you know, is it sold in Canada, or is it sold elsewhere in the world? So what they decided to do is to look at 7 comparator countries, and to look at the median of those 7 countries and compare the Canadian price to this median and make sure it does not exceed this median price. Now, the 7 countries are interesting because you've got the US, you've got the UK, you've got Sweden, Switzerland, France, Germany, and Italy. So if you think about the US, where the prices are very high, that would increase the median price of the drug. And that's why we see a lot of high prices in Canada for drugs. And there's penalties for sponsors if they do not, if they exceed the median price. So now that the drug is approved, it has to go through what we call the reimbursement process. So that's this layer here. And there's 3 different bodies that look at drugs and make recommendations about the reimbursement. So you've got the Canadian Drug Review that sits under CADTH, and they will look at drugs, all drugs, like they'll look at your cardiovascular drug, your asthma drug, antibiotic, etc. Then there's the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review that sits under CADTH, and they look specifically at cancer drugs. And if you live in Quebec, then it would be INES, and they would look at the value of a drug. So what do they do specifically? Sorry. We call these bodies PCODER and INES. And they look at the health technology assessment. And both of these organizations report into, for example, Quebec reports into the Ministry of Health in the province of Quebec, but the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review that sits under CADTH, and CADTH is the Canadian Agency to Drug and Technology in Health, is a not-profit organization that reports into all of the different provinces. So PCODER reviews the oncology drugs for the purpose of making funding recommendations based on the clinical and economic value to the provinces. So again, they look at clinical data. So a lot of the data that was submitted to Health Canada gets submitted again to PCODER, but they get submitted in a way to look at how do they compare with standard therapy, but also from a pricing perspective, are they cost effective? So is paying for a drug worth the benefit that the drug is giving to the patient, is basically the question that they would ask. INES does the same thing, but they do that for the province of Quebec. So they consider the comparative data and the pharmacoeconomic information, as well as patient input. This is really important for Myeloma Canada because PCODER does give us the opportunity to have the patient voice heard in their deliberations. So they look, as I said, the clinical evidence, the pharmacoeconomic evidence, but they also look at the patient input. And that's when we send to the myeloma communities the request for doing surveys. That's what we use to, the questions or the answers to the questions of these surveys are used to build the patient input and to demonstrate why it's important that a drug be listed on the formulary. So what they do, what these health technology assessments do is they will issue recommendations. So it's not a listing, it's just a recommendation that is given to the provinces, and usually they will either say yes, list the drug because the effectiveness or the value is there and the price is lower than what we are paying or similar than what we are paying currently. That happens very rarely. Or they will say yes with conditions, and usually the conditions will be the clinical value is there, but the price is too high, so therefore we recommend that the provinces negotiate with the manufacturer to reduce the price so it's more acceptable to them. Or they would say no. No could be no clinical benefit, or no value for the drug to be reimbursed. It's not any better, and it actually costs more than what's already there. And that process, from the time the submission is done, and this is the manufacturer that will do the submission to PCODER, that takes anywhere between 7 and 9 months. Those are averages, but what we are seeing now is that is being extended. We're seeing drugs that are being reviewed by PCODER for 10 to 12 months, because there's question. There's always a mechanism to add some new information if questions are being raised by the reviewers, which is very frustrating for, I guess, the sponsors, but also from the patient's perspective. So think, the drug is developed, it's submitting to Health Canada, it takes 12 months for it to be approved, then you're adding another 10 months or so for it to be reviewed by PCODER. So you're almost looking at 2 years after a drug is being submitted to Health Canada, or a year after it's being approved, before recommendations are made. So now the recommendations are made, and what happens to the drugs? The provinces are kind of thinking, well, what should we do? Should we list it? Should we not list it? And in the past, those listing decisions were negotiated individually by each of the provinces with the manufacturer. And so the provinces got together and said, well, this is really ridiculous. Why are we doing this? We should be working together and negotiating a pricing agreement with the manufacturer so that we can all benefit from a listing agreement or a price agreement. So what we have here is the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance process, and they're the price negotiators. They will come out with a pricing agreement, and this body is again comprised of people working for the different provinces, and provinces, territorial, and federal coalitions. So even the feds are also involved in this process, because they do have some drug plans as well. And in this PCPA process, all provinces are included. As I said before, from the recommendation, the health technology recommendation, Quebec had their own process, but now they said, hey, we want to negotiate with all the provinces too, because we want to benefit from any price reduction that can be negotiated outside of the Quebec. So they're part of the PCPA negotiations. These negotiations happen behind closed door with the manufacturer, and they will look at an acceptable price or a listing agreement based on the criteria that PCODER will have recommended for the drug. So PCODER will spit out the recommendation. The drug will go through the PCPA, a negotiation process, and manufacturers can either negotiate on a price reduction, but they can also look at what they call innovative listing agreements, where recommendations or listing will be made on specific criteria, either achieving a certain rate of success or other different schemes, but we don't see a lot of those. Usually we see negotiations being done on price because they're quicker and faster. Usually one province will take the lead and other provinces will provide their input. So in oncology, we've seen specifically Ontario and Alberta taking the lead in terms of negotiation because of the expertise that resides in those provinces. Not to say that other provinces are not involved, but in general, it's usually those two provinces. Once the negotiations are completed, the PCPA will issue a letter of intent. So that's the letter of agreement between the sponsor and the PCPA to say, well, the drug can be reimbursed at this price and under these conditions. Now, the price and the conditions are not known. This is what they consider not transparent, and so it's really hard for us to know what happens. The only thing we can do is that when the drug comes in, the provinces or PCPA and the manufacturers' feet are kept to the fire to make sure that the drug goes through fast through this process. That, as you can see, can take, again, anywhere between 6 and 12 months. So that's, again, a long, drawn negotiation where patients don't have access to a drug. So we could be now up to 2 years after a drug has been approved on the Canadian market before this pricing negotiation happens. So it doesn't mean that the price is negotiated that it's going to get paid for right away. Again, it's just a letter of agreement between the PCPA and the manufacturer to sell the drug. So what happens after that is that the provinces have to then take this letter of intent and decide what they're going to do with the drug. And those are the different provincial, federal, and territorial health and ministries of health and cancer agencies that are, in the end, the decision makers when it comes to fund a drug. So if you live in Canada, there's 4 different models of care. So, for example, if you live in Ontario, the care would be coordinated by a cancer agency. So if you have an IV drug, you will go to a hospital, and the reimbursement of that drug, but in the administration as well, would be administered under Cancer Care Ontario. If you need an oral medication in Ontario, the coverage will be under the Ontario Drug Public Plan, so a different body. So depending on what you need, you will have 2 different payers. In British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, there is comprehensive care that's provided via one cancer agency. So it's a separate body from all of the other drug reimbursement groups in these provinces. So in those provinces, you will have, for example, in BC will be the BCCA, the British Columbia Cancer Agency, and you'll have the same in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Newfoundland, Labrador, Prince Edward Island are very small. They have one payer that covers all of the cancer drugs. And in Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, it would be a hospital-based care where the responsibility of treatment coverage will be shared between either the hospital or the provincial drug plan. So you've got 4 different types of payers. Depending on where you live. So what they are going to do is they're going to look at their budget, and they're going to say, well, can we afford this drug? And, what is going to be the impact on our overall budget? And cancer agencies or drug plans have to go and hand in hand to ask for money to make sure that drugs are being approved, or they can fund these drugs in their provinces. And that's where we see a lot of delays. You think about the Atlantic provinces where the budgets are fairly small, and it takes a long time to get drug approved in those regions. So that's why we need a lot of focus and effort to make sure that cancer patients in the smaller provinces get access to the drugs. And it varies. When we talk about access to drug based on your postal code, it's very, very true in the cancer world, because it doesn't mean the drug is listed in Ontario or reimbursed in Ontario that it's going to be reimbursed in BC or in Alberta. So when it comes to when it's actually paid, you can see a lot of differences across the provinces. So that process, by the time the provinces will reimburse the drug, which means you can get it and it's reimbursed for you, it can take sometimes up to 2 years. So, think about the drugs approved on the Canadian market. It goes through the HTA process, goes through the negotiation process, and then it goes through the listing process. You could be out, 3 to 4 years. And that's where myeloma, Canada does a lot of work in making sure that we keep this process going. So you can see, as I said earlier, it's like doing your taxes, and it's quite complex. But we got to keep, going and making sure the provinces and sponsors are actually doing what they need to bring the drugs and cancer drugs to the Canadian population. So if you look, for example, the myeloma drug coverage across the country, you've got lenalidomide, bortezomib, and pomalidomide have all gone through this process, and they're now funded in the majority of provinces. So that's great. But you've got newer drugs that have been approved in the last few years, like carfilzomib, has gone through the HTA process, and had a positive recommendation, and it's currently stuck in the pricing negotiation. And we don't know what's happening as this process is non-transparent. I can't tell you if it's going to be a month or 2 or 6, we don't know. Daratumumab was approved by Health Canada last June. It has gone through the health technology assessment and was rejected for its first indication, which was in combination just with dexamethasone. Now, the company has done additional clinical trial. Phase 3 data is coming out and it shows promising outcomes for patients in the triple combination therapy, where it's given either with bortezomib or lenalidomide in combination with dexamethasone. So Myeloma Canada has done a patient submission. At the beginning of March, we made our submission to the PCODER, and we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll get a positive recommendation in 6 to 9 months. We're hopeful, but we don't know. Ixazomib, which is an oral medication, has been approved by Health Canada and is currently going through the PCODER process, and we should be hearing fairly soon when that's going to be approved or the recommendations will be made. You got elotuzumab and panobinostat. Elotuzumab has been approved by Health Canada, but the company decided that they were not going to submit the drug through the health technology assessment process because they felt they were not going to get a positive recommendation because of price. So they've decided not to launch the drug in Canada. And panobinostat is currently under review by Health Canada, and we don't know when that recommendation or the approval for the notice of compliance will be made. So we're still waiting to see on that one. Many patients have private insurance, especially in Canada. 60% of our patient population, or Canadians, I should say, have access to private insurance. So, you know, these would be what you get through your employers, or if you're retired, they would be through your retiree benefit. And if you are given a medication and you're told by, you know, your pharmacist that your drug plan will not pay for it, you can speak to your employer, or you can speak to your insurance company, and they can make exceptions for you. We find that many private insurance, you know, if what I call the squeaky wheel gets the grease, there's always ways to get them to pay for a drug. And in oncology, it varies, and you know what insurance you have and what they will pay for. But always check with your private insurance, and will they pay, if they will pay for your cancer medication. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate to you that the approval process of a drug and the funding approval process is quite long and arduous, and there are many different layers and many different touch points that are really important for us to advocate to make sure that drugs get approved quickly, and they get reimbursed quickly, and then they get to the right patient population. So Myeloma Canada, one of our pillar is advocacy. And I think that's, you know, really, really important from a patient organization to be involved and make sure that patients have access. And I define the act or of advocacy in pleading or arguing for something that is important to you, or cause that's important to you, like access to treatment. It could be an idea, or it could be changing health policy. But really advocating for self and also for access to drug is really important. We do this every day in our life, and you know, especially more and more, it needs to be done with respect to access to medication. So what kind of challenges that we face? Well, there's not a lot of opportunities for us to engage on clinical trial design and funding of those clinical trials. So it's really important for Myeloma Canada that we are involved with pharmaceutical company early in the process to make sure that develop drugs and trials that make sense for us. You know, if the administration of the drug is going to be given over 3-4 days in a row, that doesn't make sense. Is there a way that we can look at shorter duration or once every 2 weeks? You know, that's important for sponsors to understand what is important for patients, and that they use this input in designing trials that make sense for us, and that the endpoints that are being evaluated make sense for patient. Patient engagement is limited throughout these process. I mean, we're lucky at Myeloma Canada that we were pioneers in influencing Health Canada and including patient input in their review. We did this for one product so far, and we hope that this is going to become more consistent or more common. We do have the opportunity to input through the PCODER and in INES. As I mentioned earlier, they're patient submissions that we make to these bodies to make sure that they understand our needs. You know, why is it taking so long to get drugs approved? Well, there's provinces that are, you know, have all sorts of new processes or that leads to delay. So we have to put, you know, have to have our finger on the pulse, and we have to put pressure on these provinces to make sure that delays are not, you know, are not acceptable, and you know, that they need to, you know, move drugs quickly through the system because patients are waiting. You know, at the end of the day, this is about treating patients, and you know, we understand that, you know, they have to take a look at this, like take a look at their budget, but it's important from our perspective. Lack of information on process. Sometimes we don't have any information around transparency. What are the price negotiated? So, you know, we're kind of trying to work around some of these processes and make sure that our voice is heard. So, you know, we really have to be involved. And in some cases, you know, patient groups, and Myeloma has done this also in the past, have been very active on a lobby perspective and active in public campaigns and making sure that drugs are funding and that patients cannot tolerate delays in getting approval. So how is Myeloma Canada involved, and how can you be involved? It really is, we participate in the consultation process. We're there at the table to shape reimbursement environment and policies. We're involved with PCODER and INES. We are working with clinicians as well to make sure that their voice is heard through a new pilot that's being tested by PCODER for clinician input. We're a leader with Health Canada. We've also been pioneer when Velcade was just approved in Canada in 2006, where we were going through a change in Ontario where everything was easy to get listed and then became hard. So we worked really hard with Velcade, and we did the same for Revlimid. And a lot of the tools and what you can do can be found on our guidebook that is on our website. It's our advocacy guidebook. So one of the things you can do is get involved, participate, and be engaged in our community. Join our mailing list through our website. You can, you know, download myeloma.ca and you have all the information that you need there. We're starting on March 30th our new action campaign, our advocacy and action campaign. You know, it will be a microsite that you can find on our website, and we'll have a whole campaign from Facebook, and where you'll be able to go onto the website and you will be able to look at what you can do. So there will be a call to action. So talking about the need for treatment access, you can send a letter to your MPP or an MLA. You just need to enter your name, your email, your address. Most important is your postal code. And then when you click to add your voice, a screen will pop up with a letter addressed to your local MPP or MLA, depending on where you live. And you know, it will talk about access to new treatments for myeloma patients, and you can sort of take this template and you can personalize it, add anything you want to make it more personal to you, and then you just click and it's sent directly to your MPP or an MNA. So as a patient, you and your loved one are empowered to make decisions and be involved in the decision making. You can take action to get the care that you need, to the medication prescribed by your physician. So you have the right to speak to your doctor about the medications that are available to treat your condition. You should ask your physician about any clinical trial that may be suitable to you. You can speak to your insurance company or an employer if you don't have access to the drug, as again, squeaky wheel gets the grease. I've seen many patients get approval from their employer to pay for a drug. Ask a patient advocacy group like Myeloma Canada to advocate for yourself. I've been doing this for 30 years. So you can certainly give me a call, send me an email. If you have an issue, I'd be more than happy to help. Speaking to your government officials, go and see them. Your MPP are in their offices every Friday. That's their constituency day, and they will take meetings with you because they're there to represent you, and they'll talk to you. Write letters to your government representative, and ask them to get back to you. Ask them to consider your cause and to do something for you. So there's other ways that you continue to get involved or be involved. Obviously, Facebook is a great way through either Facebook or Twitter to be informed and get information from your peers. Sign a petition, email your MPP or an MLA, call your member of parliament, participate in an event, go to the Myeloma Canada Walk, go to Legislative Assembly. I know we had one last year in Alberta. We're going to have one in Ottawa this year. So, take part in these activities. So that concludes my presentation. I know there's been a lot of information that I've sort of shared with you, and I understand if it's, it's very dry, and but I'm here to help you, and you have a lot of information on our website. So please go there or contact us directly. So I think we have some time for questions. So Michelle, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martine. That was extremely informative, very detailed, and I think it's the attendees will agree with me and say that it was quite eye-opening to understand the process. I think I just want to firstly remind everyone while I'm waiting for questions to come in here, that this session is being recorded. I know there was a lot of information that went out today, so if you were late in attending, you may have missed me saying that, but the session is being recorded. It will be put up on our YouTube channel most likely tomorrow at the latest, tomorrow afternoon. We'll also be sending it out in our newsletter as well for the link, so stay tuned for that. If you do have any questions and you want to reach Martine, her email is Elias, so ELIAS, at myeloma.ca. If you forget that and don't know how to find it, you can go to, again, myeloma.ca, our website, and go under About Myeloma Canada, and you will see our staff listing there, which you'll be able to find Martine's contact information there. So I actually don't have any questions coming in for the moment, so I guess we'll wait for a minute or two for anything to come in.
Either I answered all the question or it was just too complicated.
Yeah. Well, you can, if just a reminder, if you want to type a question, anyone, you can go onto your panel that's on your computer screen. There is a questions feature, and you just type the question and I will receive it, and I'll be able to share that with Martine. Also, if you do want any more information on anything to do with drug approval process, access, advocacy, how drugs get approved in Canada, you can go to myeloma.ca, then you go into About Multiple Myeloma, and then you'll get there's a section specifically on the drug approval process. I do have someone who's raising their hand here, but I don't have a question that has come in. Perhaps wait for that. Oh, there it is. Okay. Here's a question, Martine. Why is it important to have the patient voice represented in the HTA process?
That's a very good question, and we kind of pondered with that at the beginning. Health technology assessment actually takes into consideration, especially in oncology, the PCODER process actually rates the patient input. It's part of one of the decision factors. So it weighs just as much as the clinical or the efficacy into their decision. And I've seen where the patient input has either confirmed a decision or recommendation made by the health technology assessment body. And it actually helps to have the people who are reviewing this information understand the perspective of the patient, because many times they don't have necessarily a myeloma expert that are reviewing the information, so they can't really put it into context. So having that input is really important. Now, is it the best that it could potentially be? Probably not. I mean, they look at different criteria. They look at, cost effectiveness, quality of life. Is there other measures that are important from a patient's perspective to be added to this evaluation? We believe so. And there are some patient organizations that are looking at patient value to develop a better measure or metrics of why it's important, why the patient voice is important, and they can then play a bigger role in the evaluation. So it is important that we continue to develop that avenue that is available to us. And, I would like to see where decisions are made. Obviously, the drug has to work, but that, the patient value becomes the number one reason why drugs are being reimbursed.
Thank you for that. So here's another one. My husband has had his chemo stopped because his neutrophils were too low. He was hospitalized and given Neupogen, which was free in the hospital. Had he have been an outpatient, we would have had to pay $150 for it. Is this what would somehow be covered if he requires it again as an outpatient? And if so, who would approve it?
Usually that, I would assume that, you're living in Ontario, because that's a fairly common situation that happens in Ontario, where you go to the hospital, the drug is paid for because it's covered under the hospital budget. And then once you go into the community, you have to pay for it. It does happen. It's not unusual that this happens. I would say if you have a private insurance, go back to your private insurance, ask them to cover for the drug, or you can also go to the manufacturer of the drug, the Neupogen, and ask them if they have a compassionate program. I didn't mention any information about compassionate program, but many pharmaceutical companies do have access or the ability to give a drug for free if certain conditions are met during this reimbursement process. So that's also another route that can be taken.
Okay, excellent. So someone's asking, I think I can answer this question, is where do we get the form you showed to send to the government? Now, thanks for the question. And again, this is a program that we're actually officially going to be launching on Thursday, which is March 30th. That's deemed Myeloma Action Day internationally. So that's the day we've chosen to launch this program. And it will be available from that day moving forward. You can, if you'd like to have a sneak peek of it, visit the site www.myelomacommunity.ca. That's where you'll find the letter is on there. But we will be sending out an e-blast on Thursday with all the instructions of what to do. And of course, it will be made available on social media as well. Hope that answers that question. And of course, it will be on our website too. If you can't find that one, there will be a link from our homepage.
And if you can't find it, you can always call us and we'll help you find it.
Okay, and here's another one. Does Myeloma Canada have the contacts at the drug companies if we need to appeal to them?
Yes. I would.
In the short answer.
Yes, we do. We do have relationship with the different pharmaceutical company, and I have spoken to them in the past about access to drugs. I mean, I can't really discuss specific medical issues or private information, but there's ways to approach pharmaceutical company and explain our case and see what can be done, and that's called that's advocacy, and that's what I'm here for. So yes, we can do this.
Great. So I actually don't have any other questions coming in, so I think that'll conclude our session for this evening. If you think of something after we log off, not a problem. Again, you can always email Martine at melias@myeloma.ca. Again, if you forget or can't find your email, go to our website, www.myeloma.ca. Under About Myeloma Canada, you will find our staff listing, which you'll be able to reach us there. So thank you very much, everyone. And that is it for this evening. We will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.